The moment my husband's hand wrapped around the back of my neck, I thought it was an accident. It wasn't. He pressed down firmly, deliberately, and my face went straight into the birthday cake I had spent 4 hours making from scratch. Frosting filled my eyes. The hard base split my lip. Around me, people laughed, cameras rolled, and Sloane Beckett stood just behind Grant with a smile she didn't bother to hide. Grant told me to stop being so sensitive. He told me to smile for the cameras, so I wouldn't ruin the image he'd spent years building. I didn't smile. I wiped the frosting from my eyes, unpinned my mother's silver brooch from what was left of the cake, and looked at my husband without saying a single word he deserved. What Grant didn't know, what none of them knew, was that the woman covered in buttercream was the sole heir to the Ravenport fortune. And she had already decided what came next. If you've ever watched someone underestimate the wrong person, stay with me, because this story is just getting started. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss what happens next. I used to think silence was a form of protection. If I stayed quiet enough, small enough, I could live an ordinary life without anyone reaching in to take something from me. That belief carried me through the years after my mother died, and my father's health began to fail, through the months I spent stepping back from everything that bore the Ravenport name, handing authority to the trust, keeping only Juliet Marin's number saved in my phone, as a thread connecting me to who I actually was. I wasn't hiding from the world. I was giving myself permission to exist in it, without being defined by what I'd inherited. When I met Grant, I introduced myself the way I'd introduced myself to everyone during those years. Rosalie Quinn, baking instructor at a community center on the east side of Belhaven. That was true. Every Tuesday and Thursday morning, I stood at a flour-dusted counter and taught people how to fold dough, how to read the color of a crust, how to make something with their hands that would feed someone they loved. It was the most honest work I'd ever done, and I loved it without apology. Grant said he loved that about me, my simplicity, my lack of ambition in the climbing sense. He said he'd spent enough time around people who wanted things from him, and that I was different. I believed him. That was my first mistake, not in the naive sense, but in the way that trusting someone you love is always a kind of risk you choose to take with your eyes open. I chose it. I kept choosing it even as the man I'd married slowly became someone I didn't recognize. Grant founded Duval Signature Events 2 years into our marriage. On the surface, the company moved fast, corporate galas, high-end weddings, charity dinners that got written up in Belhaven's social pages. He had a talent for presentation, for making things look more polished than they were. What I didn't know then, and only pieced together later, was that the shine was borrowed. Vendor invoices were being deferred. Client deposits were being pulled forward to cover costs from previous events. A short-term loan was sitting on the books like a slow leak, and the pressure of it was changing him in ways he never named out loud, but showed in 100 smaller ways: the impatience at dinner, the way he'd look at me sometimes as though calculating what I was worth to him. He hired Sloane Beckett about 18 months before my birthday. She came in as his image director, which meant she managed his social media presence, curated the aesthetic of every event the company touched, and positioned Grant Duval as a visionary entrepreneur on the rise. She was good at it. She was also, as I eventually understood, far more personally invested in Grant's success than her job title suggested. His mother, Helena, approved of her immediately, which told me everything I needed to know about what Helena had always thought of me. Helena Duval was a woman who understood status the way some people understand weather, instinctively, without having to think about it. She had looked at me from the first Sunday dinner and decided I was a passing inconvenience. Her daughter Mallory, who was 24 and treated life like a continuous content opportunity, had simply followed her mother's lead. I didn't fight it. I told myself it didn't matter what they thought of me. I had my classes, the particular quiet satisfaction of watching someone pull a perfectly risen loaf from the oven for the first time. I had the calls with Juliet, who kept me updated on the trust on my father's care arrangements, on the legal scaffolding that held the Ravenport assets in place while I lived my smaller chosen life. I believed, a marriage imperfect, sometimes strained, but real. My birthday changed that. Grant announced he wanted to throw me a party at Rosebridge Club. He said it with warmth, with the specific energy of someone who wants to be seen as generous, and I accepted because I thought he meant it. I made the cake myself, a cream-frosted layer cake decorated with pale violet sugar flowers, the same shade of purple my mother had always worn. It was a private thing, that color, a way of bringing her into a room she'd never get to enter. I carried the cake to Rosebridge myself that evening, and when I set it on the table, Helena looked at it the way you look at something a child has made tolerant, faintly pitying. Mallory pulled out her phone and filmed it from multiple angles, narrating in a low voice that it looked like something from the discount shelf at a grocery store. I let it go. I was good at letting things go. But then I looked around the room and understood what the evening actually was. The backdrop behind the cake table was printed with the Duval Signature Events logo. The guests were not our friends. They were Grant's contacts, media people, influencers that Sloane had personally invited and briefed. There were cameras positioned at angles that had nothing to do with capturing a birthday and everything to do with capturing content. Sloane moved through the space like she owned it, adjusting the lighting, redirecting guests, standing close enough to Grant that anyone who didn't know better might have assumed she was his wife. I was 32 years old, and I was a prop at my own birthday party. When the moment came to blow out the candles, Sloane announced brightly, as though doing me a favor, that they should do a birthday challenge for the video. Something fun, she said. Something that would get people sharing. Grant laughed and said he'd just put a little frosting on my nose. That was how he framed it, something light, something harmless. Something I was supposed to smile through, because that was what a supportive wife did. What he actually did was place his full hand on the back of my head and push my face into the cake. Not playfully, not gently. He pushed with the deliberate force of someone who had already decided the outcome and didn't much care about the details. The base of the cake was denser than the frosted top, and when my face hit it, I felt my lower lip split against the hard sponge. Frosting pressed into my eyes, my nose, my hair. I heard laughter, several voices, then more, and Mallory saying something about how they finally had their moment. Sloane's voice came from just behind Grant, smooth and satisfied. Now that's content. Grant's hand was still on my neck when I pushed myself upright. I didn't apologize. He told me not to be so sensitive. He told me to smile for the cameras because making a scene would embarrass him in front of people who mattered to the company. He said it quietly, the way you say something you've rehearsed. And I looked at him, really looked at him, and understood that he had known exactly what he was doing and had done it anyway because he had long since decided that my feelings were a cost he was willing to absorb. I didn't cry. I didn't raise my voice. I reached into the wreckage of the cake and unpinned my mother's silver brooch from where it had been pressed into the frosting, wiped my eyes with the back of my hand, and looked at Grant one more time. I'll remember exactly how you chose to celebrate the day I was born, I said. Then I walked out. The drive home was 20 minutes of complete silence. By the time I changed out of the ruined dress and sat down at the kitchen table, my phone was already showing notifications. The video had been posted by Mallory within the hour, captioned with something about how some wives just couldn't take a joke. Sloane had reposted it to the Duval Signature Events account, with language about bold, unexpected moments. My split lip was not visible in the version they'd shared. The laughter was. Grant didn't come home until well after midnight. I was still at the kitchen table when he walked in, and I asked him calmly about the credit account. The one I'd received an alert for earlier that evening. A new line of credit opened in my name, already carrying charges for a dress, a weekend reservation, a quantity of advertising spend, and a piece of jewelry delivered to Sloane's office. He told me I must have signed something without reading it. He told me I was trying to start a fight because I was jealous. He told me that the house we were sitting in belonged to him because he was the one who kept this family financially solvent, and that if I wanted to keep living here, I should think carefully about the kind of trouble I was considering making. He went upstairs. I sat very still, then picked up my phone and called Juliet. She answered on the second ring, which was one of the things about Juliet I had always relied on without ever saying so. I told her what had happened, the party, the cake, the credit account, the threat about the house. She listened without interrupting. And when I finished, she asked me one question: did I want to move quickly or carefully? I knew what moving quickly meant. I could reveal who I was tomorrow morning and watch the entire Duval household reconfigure itself around that information in real time. I could have Grant removed from the property before the week was out. I could end this cleanly and loudly and be done with it by the weekend. But I thought about what Grant had said, that he would make sure I had nowhere to go. I thought about the way he'd pushed my face into that cake with such ease, such confidence, such complete certainty that there would be no consequence. He believed that because he believed I was powerless. And if he found out tonight that he was wrong, he would start destroying things, messages, financial records, the paper trail that connected him to that credit account, and whatever else Juliet was beginning to suspect. Carefully, I said. Juliet told me not to confront him again before she had time to pull the documentation together. I spent the next hour making copies, the video, the credit alert, the text messages from that evening, the voicemail. Helena had left earlier in the week. I saved them to a drive I kept separate from anything Grant had access to. And then I made one more decision from this point forward. I would record every in-person interaction that took place in this house. Not because I was planning something dramatic, but because I had just watched my husband push my face into a cake and tell me I had nowhere to go, and I understood now that the only protection I had was documentation. Then I sat on the edge of the bed in the guest room, took off my wedding ring, and set it next to my mother's brooch on the nightstand. I wasn't angry exactly. Anger would have been simpler. What I felt was something more like clarity, the particular kind that arrives when you finally stop trying to explain something away and let yourself see it plainly. Grant had not pushed my face into that cake because he'd lost his judgment for a moment. He had done it because he believed the cost was zero. He had threatened me with homelessness because he believed I had no recourse. He had opened a line of credit in my name because he believed I would never be able to prove it. Every one of those calculations depended on a single assumption that I was nobody. I called Juliet back and told her what I'd decided. I wasn't going to tell Grant who I was. Not yet. I wanted him to face what he'd done as himself, not as a man who'd accidentally humiliated the wrong woman, but as a man who had chosen deliberately and repeatedly to treat a person he believed was powerless as though she didn't deserve basic decency. That was the thing I needed the record to show. I don't want him punished for not knowing I have money, I told her. I want him held accountable for what he did when he thought I had none. Juliet said she'd have the first documents ready by morning. I didn't sleep. I lay in the dark of the guest room with my mother's brooch in my hand, thinking about the violet sugar flowers I'd spent an entire afternoon making, and the way they'd looked before Grant pressed my face through them. I thought about how sure he had been, how completely unshakably sure that the party was his to control, that I was his to humiliate, that the house was his to threaten me with, that the future was already written and I wasn't in it. I was wrong about all of it. He just didn't know it yet. By the following morning, the video had been viewed more than 40,000 times. I know because Juliet sent me the numbers alongside the first set of documents, both arriving in my inbox before 7 a.m. Sloane had edited the footage down to its most flattering version, flattering for Grant, that is. The portion where my lip bled was gone. What remained was a loop of guests laughing, Grant grinning, and me straightening up with frosting across my face in a way that Sloane's caption framed as a woman who simply couldn't take a joke. The Duval Signature Events account reposted it with language about authentic moments and bold brand energy. By midday, Grant had gone live on his own profile to address what he called an unfair reaction from people who didn't know his wife's tendency toward drama. He said I had agreed to the bit beforehand. He said I was trying to make him look bad because I was threatened by his success. He said it with the calm, reasonable tone of someone who has practiced being believed. And I watched the comments fill up with people who had decided based on 30 seconds of edited video exactly who I was and exactly what I deserved. I didn't respond publicly. Juliet had advised against it, and I agreed not because I was afraid, but because anything I said would give Grant something to react to, and I wasn't interested in performing my own victimhood for an audience. The documents mattered more than the comments. What Juliet confirmed by the end of that first day was substantial. The house at Renford Square had been purchased entirely through the Northlight Heritage Trust before our marriage, which meant Grant had no legal ownership, no right to sell or mortgage it, and no grounds to remove me from it, regardless of what he believed about who paid for what. The prenuptial agreement, which Grant had signed without much scrutiny, because at the time he'd thought it was a standard formality and hadn't wanted to appear difficult, protected every Ravenport asset from any marital claim. The credit account opened in my name had originated from a device registered to Grant's office network. The electronic signature on the application showed irregularities consistent with a copied or fabricated authorization. I read through all of it at the kitchen table while Grant slept upstairs, and I felt something settle in my chest, not relief exactly, but the particular steadiness that comes from knowing the ground beneath you is solid even when someone is insisting it isn't. Helena arrived at the house on the third day. She didn't call ahead. She appeared at the front door in the mid-morning with the specific composure of a woman who had decided the visit was a formality, and she came in before I fully opened the door. She sat down in the living room, set her bag on the cushion beside her, and produced what appeared to be a handwritten list. It was, she explained, a record of everything the Duval family had provided during the course of our marriage dinners, introductions, holiday gatherings, the general grace of being included in a family that had standards. She presented it not as a fond accounting of shared history, but as an invoice. She said that a woman in my position with my background should understand what she owed and behave accordingly. I sat across from her and listened without speaking, which seemed to unsettle her more than an argument would have. Then she said that if I continued to resist signing Grant's agreement and refused to leave quietly, she would make sure the community center where I taught knew exactly what kind of person I was. She had connections there, she said. She knew people on the board. A word from her in the right direction, and my classes would disappear by the end of the month. She said it pleasantly, as though offering advice. I told her I'd heard her and thanked her for coming by. She left looking dissatisfied, which was the correct response to a threat that hadn't landed the way she intended. What she didn't know was that I had been recording since the moment she walked through the door, exactly as I had decided to do the night of my birthday, and that every word of what she'd said was now saved to the same drive as everything else. The following week, Grant announced at breakfast that Duval Signature Events had been invited to present at the Bellhaven Hospitality Futures Summit, hosted at the Crownstone Hotel. He said it as though reporting a victory, and in his framing, it was a chance to secure an exclusive events contract with 12 high-end hotel properties, the kind of deal that would put his company into a tier he'd been trying to reach for years. He was going to present with Sloane. She had the presence for this kind of room, he said. She knew how to represent the brand. He looked at me across the table and said I should stay home. He said the hospitality world required a certain kind of confidence, a certain facility with high-stakes social environments, and that my skill set was better suited to what I already did. He said it not unkindly, which was almost worse, the tone of someone writing off a liability without any particular malice, just efficiency. "You're good at what you do," he said. Meaning the baking, meaning the community center, meaning everything he had decided was the ceiling of my life. Stick to that. He left the table before I could answer, which meant he wasn't interested in one. That evening, Juliet sent me a confidential briefing. I read it standing at the kitchen counter with my phone in one hand and the other pressed flat against the tile because what I was reading required something steady to hold on to. The Crownstone Hotel belonged to Ravenport Hospitality Group. Every property in the network Grant was trying to access, all 12 venues, was owned by my family's company. Duval Signature Events had not been invited because of strong performance or industry reputation. It had been placed on a risk assessment list and was under active due diligence review. Ravenport Capital was currently evaluating whether to offer a financial rescue package to prevent the company from collapsing before its outstanding client obligations could be fulfilled. And every decision in that process, every contract approval, every capital authorization, every final call required the signature of the controlling heir, mine. The summit was also the occasion on which the Ravenport board had scheduled the formal announcement of the group's new chair. After months of my father's declining health and the trust's interim administration, the succession had been finalized. The announcement would be paid that evening at the Crownstone in front of the industry's most prominent figures. Grant had told me to stay home and make bread. He was going to walk into a room that belonged to me. I set my phone down and stood very still for a long moment, and then I allowed myself to feel the full weight of it. The precise, almost architectural irony of a man who had ground my face into a cake and told me I had no place in his world, walking into a building my grandfather had built and asking for a contract my signature controlled. I felt it completely, and then I let it pass through me, and what remained was a decision. I told Juliet I would be at the Crownstone. I also told her I wanted the due diligence on Duval Signature Events, conducted without interference from me. Whatever the company's situation was, I wanted it evaluated on its actual merits for the sake of the employees who had nothing to do with Grant's choices. In the days that followed, Grant accelerated everything. He and Sloane toured a new apartment together, which Mallory documented on her social media, with captions that made Sloane sound like a permanent fixture the family had upgraded to. Helena hosted dinners for Grant's business contacts, at which Sloane sat in the chair that had been mine at every family gathering for 4 years. Grant sent a formal divorce agreement to the house by courier, a document that required me to vacate the property, within 14 days relinquish any claim to his company, confirm publicly that the birthday video had been a consensual joke, and leave with nothing beyond my personal clothing and baking equipment. In exchange, he was offering a sum of money so small it read less like a settlement and more like a dismissal fee. I did not sign it. Grant responded by canceling the household bank card and resetting the security codes on the house system. He sent a text explaining that he was managing household expenses going forward and that I should let him know when I was ready to be reasonable. The text had the energy of someone who believed that controlling access to money was the same as controlling a person, and that the person in question had no other options. Juliet restored my access to the property systems within the hour because the house had never been Grant's to lock in the first place. I didn't tell him that. I let him believe the tactic had worked because a man who thought he had leverage would keep using it, and every use left a record. By the end of that week, the due diligence team had completed their preliminary findings, and what they found confirmed what Juliet had suspected from the beginning. Client deposits had been redirected into a promotional account that Sloane managed directly. Grant had reported contracts in the company's financials that did not exist in signed form. Personal expenses, dinners, travel. The apartment viewings had been logged as client entertainment. Sloane had been collecting commissions from vendors. She herself had brought into the company a conflict of interest that had never been disclosed. And the credit account in my name had been used to purchase the dress Sloane wore to my birthday party and the bracelet delivered to her office with transactions originating directly from Grant's business devices. Juliet told me the company could collapse before the summit if nothing intervened. She also told me that if I moved too early, Grant would have time to scrub the records. So I waited. I had become by that point quite practiced at waiting. The morning of the Bellhaven Hospitality Futures Summit. Grant came downstairs in a new suit. He looked the way people look when they believe they are about to receive something they've always deserved. Bright, certain, slightly self-congratulatory. Sloane was waiting outside in a car they'd coordinated without bothering to conceal it. Before he reached the door, he turned back and placed the divorce agreement on the kitchen counter already open to the signature page. "Tonight changes everything," he said. "You should think about where you want to be when it does." He meant it as a warning. He left without looking at me again. An hour later, my phone lit up with a photo from Sloane, the two of them standing on the steps of the Crownstone Hotel, dressed and composed and triumphant. The message beneath it read, "Some women are made for the kitchen, some are made for the boardroom." She had sent it to me directly, which told me she wanted me to see it, which told me she still believed the geography of that image gave her an advantage. Then Helena called for the last time. She didn't want to persuade me of anything. That phase was over. She called to inform me in the flat tone of someone closing an account that she had already been in contact with Grant's legal team and had taken steps to ensure I had no viable claim on anything connected to the Duval name. She said I had never belonged in her son's life. She said signing quietly was the only dignified option left to me. And then she said something she meant as a final blow, but which instead clarified everything. If I had been the kind of woman who mattered, none of this would have happened. She was right in the way that people are sometimes right about the wrong things. If I'd been the kind of woman she understood how to recognize with a name she could place a family she'd heard of, she would have treated me differently from the very first Sunday dinner. The treatment I had received for 4 years was not personal. It was simply what she did to people she had decided were safe to discard. I hung up and went to get dressed. I chose a simple black dress and pinned my mother's brooch at the collar. I looked at myself in the mirror for a moment, not performing anything for anyone, just checking that I was steady. I was. I signed the receipt, confirming I had received the divorce agreement. I did not sign the agreement itself. Then I picked up my bag and walked out of the house at Renford Square, and I drove to the Crownstone Hotel, not to fight for my marriage, not to confront my husband, but to take my place in a room he had told me I wasn't qualified to enter. The Crownstone Hotel was everything my family had built it, to be tall ceilings, warm light, the kind of quiet grandeur that doesn't announce itself, but simply exists the way old certainty exists without needing to explain. I had been inside this building dozens of times as a child, trailing behind my father while he shook hands and checked sight lines and asked the staff questions by name. I knew the back corridors, the service elevator, the particular way the ballroom acoustics shifted when the room was full. Walking through the lobby that evening past the floral arrangements and the registration tables and the guests in their event attire, I felt something I hadn't expected to feel, a sense of homecoming so quiet it almost didn't register. Juliet was waiting for me near the private elevator. She handed me a folder without preamble and pressed the button for the upper floor. We had 20 minutes before the formal program began. The boardroom, above the main hall, had been prepared for the Ravenport succession review, a long table, the full trust council, the final audit on Duval signature events laid out in organized sections. I sat at the head of the table for the first time, and no one in the room treated it as unusual, because to them it wasn't. To them, this was simply where I belonged. I had spent 4 years living as though I needed permission to take up space, and here were 12 people who had been waiting patiently, professionally, for me to walk through the door. The audit findings were thorough. Client deposits had been misappropriated. Contracts had been falsified. Personal expenditures, including every charge on the credit account opened in my name, had been run through the company's books under categories designed to obscure their real purpose. The due diligence team's conclusion was measured but clear: the company retained operational value. The staff on the events floor had performed their work with no knowledge of or involvement in the financial irregularities, and any rescue structure would need to begin with the complete removal of the current leadership. Grant and Sloane could not remain in any capacity that gave them access to company funds or client relationships. I reviewed the conditions and signed the approval for the employee protection package. The rest: Grant's personal liability, the fraudulent credit account. What happened to him specifically? I left to the legal process already in motion. I wasn't there to destroy him. I was there to make sure the people who had done nothing wrong didn't pay for the choices of the person who had. Downstairs in the ballroom, Grant was working the room with the focused energy of someone who had staked everything on a single evening. He introduced Sloane to clusters of industry contacts with variations on the same narrative: the visionary founder, the dynamic partner, the company on the verge of its breakthrough moment. He told at least one person, a board member later, informed Juliet that his wife had recently decided to step back from public life and that he was grateful for the fresh start. He said it easily. He had already rewritten the story. The host took the stage at 8 o'clock and opened with a welcome from the Ravenport Hospitality Group, a hospitality empire valued in the billions, spanning hotels, resorts, and conference properties across the region, built across 3 decades by a man who had started with a single property and a very clear idea of what quality meant. Then he spoke about the succession the industry had been anticipating and the formal announcement of the group's incoming chair. The name on the main screen appeared in letters large enough to read from anywhere in the room: Rosalie Quinn Ravenport. And then I walked out from the side of the stage. I didn't look for Grant immediately. I didn't need to. I could feel the shift in the room, the way you feel a temperature change, something collective, something that moved through the crowd in a wave I didn't have to track to understand. I stepped to the podium and arranged my notes, and in the peripheral quiet, before I began to speak, I heard nothing from the direction where Grant had been standing. That silence was its own kind of information. I spoke about the company, about what my father had built, about the responsibility of scale, about the kind of leadership that the next chapter required. I didn't mention my marriage. I didn't reference the video or the birthday or any of it. What I said instead toward the end was something I had been turning over in my mind for days: that the character of any organization could be measured not by how it treated its most valuable relationships, but by how it treated the ones it believed it could afford to neglect. That the instinct to perform generosity toward people who could benefit you while cutting costs on people who couldn't was not strategy, it was a liability, and eventually it always appeared on the books. The applause was warm. I stepped back from the podium, and then Juliet appeared at my elbow and said the private meeting room was ready. Grant and Sloane had been escorted there by 2 members of the legal team while I was still on stage. By the time I arrived, Grant had already moved through his first reaction. The shock had burned off into anger, which was easier for him to manage. He stood when I entered, which seemed involuntary, and then appeared to regret it. He said I had deceived him. He said I had hidden who I was for the entire duration of our relationship, and that nothing between us had been built on honest ground, and that if anyone in the room should be answering for something, it was me. I let him finish. Then I said, I kept one name from you. You kept a girlfriend, a set of debts, and a fraudulent line of credit in my name. Those are not the same thing. Juliet set the documents on the table between us, the cease of negotiation, with the current leadership, the asset, freeze notice, the credit account, findings, the conditions for the company, restructuring, and the formal response to the divorce agreement Grant had left on the kitchen counter that morning. Grant looked at the stack without touching it. Then he said that if he had known who I was, he would have treated me differently. I looked at him for a moment, at the suit he'd bought for tonight, at the particular expression of a man who believes an explanation is the same as an apology, and I said, that's exactly why you were never supposed to know. Sloane had been quiet since I entered, which was unusual enough that I noticed it. She had positioned herself slightly behind Grant's left shoulder, in the posture of someone calculating distance from the center of blame. When Juliet announced that all financial accounts connected to the company, including the promotional account, Sloane managed personally, would be frozen pending the full audit, something in Sloane's composure cracked at the edges. She straightened and said she wanted her own attorney present before saying anything further, which was her right, and Juliet confirmed that was understood and that the freeze would remain in place in the interim. It was in the silence after that, a real silence, the kind that comes when options are visibly narrowing, that Sloane turned to Grant and said it was his information that had made any of it possible, that she had followed his instructions, that the account in my name had been opened using details he had provided, and that his exact words had been that I had already agreed, and that the funds would be replaced once the Ravenport contract came through. She said it to Grant, not to the room, but the room heard it. The meeting was being formally documented, as all parties had been informed at the outset, and every word Sloane had just said was now part of the record. Grant started to respond, and then stopped, because there was nothing useful he could say. He had described the mechanics of what had been done, and named him as the architect of it, and his silence confirmed more than a denial would have. The meeting concluded with each party in possession of the relevant documents. I walked out first. In the weeks that followed, the legal and financial consequences sorted themselves, the way such things do when the documentation is thorough and the parties have run out of useful fictions. Grant was removed from Duval Signature Events formally by the conditions of the restructuring agreement, and practically because there was no version of the company's survival that included him in any position of authority. The renamed company, rebuilt around its competent operations staff, was placed under interim management and began the process of repaying its client obligations. Sloane was dismissed. The commissions she had collected from vendors she had personally placed into the company's supply chain were folded into the audit findings. Without the company platform, without Grant's contacts, without the particular social architecture she had spent 2 years constructing, she became someone the industry simply didn't return calls to. That was not a punishment I arranged. It was a consequence she had built for herself, one transaction at a time. Mallory deleted the birthday video. Juliet had preserved the original, the timestamp, the caption, the edit history, all of it, so the deletion changed nothing legally. But I understood why Mallory had done it. She had watched her family's behavior, which had seemed so safe while directed at a woman they believed had no recourse, suddenly become visible to people who understood exactly who that woman was. Helena sent a letter written in the measured tone of someone who believes that the correct framing of an apology can function as a settlement. She said she hadn't known who I was, that if she had known things would have been different. And she implied that an acknowledgement of this on my part would be the gracious response. I didn't respond to the letter, and I didn't agree to meet her. What I knew and what I suspected Helena also knew was that the recording from the morning she had appeared at my house sat in a file that could become relevant if she chose to re-engage. I hadn't used it. I didn't need to. The knowledge that it existed was enough to establish a boundary that Helena, whatever her faults, understood. Grant came to the house at Renford Square one final time on a Tuesday evening without calling ahead. He said he still had feelings for me. He said that the pressure of the company's situation had made him into someone he didn't recognize, and that everything, the birthday, Sloane, the credit account, had come from desperation, not cruelty, and that he hoped I could see the difference. I asked him whether he was asking for the marriage back or for me to withdraw the legal filings. He didn't answer. The fact that he couldn't answer quickly was the most honest thing he had communicated to me in years. Juliet delivered the formal notice shortly after he left the house at Renford Square, held entirely by the Northlight Heritage Trust, was not subject to any marital claim, and Grant's right of residency contingent on the marriage was no longer operative. He had 2 weeks to collect his belongings. He took 1. I decided to sell the house. Not because I needed to, and not because I couldn't have remained there comfortably, but because every room in it held the shape of a version of myself that had spent 4 years making itself smaller to accommodate someone else's certainty about what I was worth. I didn't want to live inside that shape anymore. I found an apartment with wide windows and good light close to the Ravenport offices and close to the care facility where my father was receiving treatment. I went to see him twice a week. We didn't talk much, his health made conversation difficult, but I would sit with him and tell him about the work, and sometimes he would squeeze my hand, and that was enough. The Quinn Initiative launched 6 months after the Crownstone evening. I named it after my mother's family, not the Ravenport name, which carried its own weight, but the quieter one she had given me when she wanted me to move through the world unburdened. The program offered legal consultation, credit review, short-term housing support, financial planning, and evidence preservation guidance to people navigating financial control in their marriages. It was not the largest thing the Ravenport Group funded that year. It was the one I cared about most. A year after my birthday, I organized a small gathering at the community center garden where I had taught my baking classes. I made a cream-frosted cake and decorated it with pale violet sugar flowers, the same ones I had pressed my mother's brooch into the year before. The people around me this time were the ones who had always been there without my fully appreciating it. My father in a wheelchair, now but present. Juliet, who had never once suggested that the simple life I was choosing was a mistake. And a group of students from the Thursday class who had brought their own contributions to the table and asked no questions about why the gathering was happening, only whether there was enough for seconds. No one lifted a camera to record me. No one asked me to perform contentment I wasn't feeling. No one required me to be smaller or simpler or more convenient than I actually was. I cut the first slice and set it in front of my mother's photograph, which I had brought in a small frame and placed at the corner of the table. The silver brooch was on my dress, not as a secret I was managing anymore, but as a reminder. My value had never originated from the name Ravenport. It had existed in the years I spent making things with my hands and teaching other people to do the same in the choices I made when I had every reason to act from anger and chose instead to act from principle in the simple fact of having been all along someone worth knowing, even in the moment my husband had believed otherwise. The cake was exactly as good as I had made it the year before. This time I got to eat it. Here's what I want to leave you with. Your worth has never depended on whether the people around you were paying attention. Rosalie didn't become valuable the moment her name appeared on that screen. She had been valuable the entire time. In every class, she taught every choice she made to act from principle instead of anger. Every quiet moment, she held her ground without needing anyone to witness it. If you're in a season where someone has decided you're easy to overlook, remember that their assessment of you is not the final word. It never was. If this story stayed with you, share it with someone who needs to hear it today, and subscribe to the channel so you're here for the next one. We'll see you soon.